Happy Advent, Wednesday Conversation listeners. I'm Pastor Bob Thune of Coram Church, and I'm here to introduce a special episode that we are going to revisit for the next 2 weeks. On Wednesdays, as you know, we sit down to talk about how the gospel of Jesus Christ connects to the questions and issues of everyday life. And today, we are responding to a question from a listener emailed to the podcast recently. I'm going to read that email now. Hi, Wednesday Conversation team. First, thank you for doing this show. It's a lot of work to run a church, and so to add this incredible resource on top is a huge undertaking. I appreciate the effort and intentionality that goes into this. I want to request a topic that I assume many listeners would come across at some point in their life, and so hoping this could make it on the list to cover: family planning in a God-honoring way. You have discussed this in the past, so this is more just a refresh episode, but it was so long ago that you can't even find it on Apple's list of episodes. He goes on to say a few nice things and then close, listener Justin, Wednesday Conversation listener. Well, Justin, first of all, thanks for your kind words about the podcast. And second, you are right. Those episodes were a long time ago. And in fact, I think they were like 4 or 5 episodes. So here's what we did. We went back to that episode and we condensed it down into just a simple 2-episode part 1 and part 2 on this topic. I feel like this is one of the best episodes or one of the best topics we've ever covered on this podcast. And so in light of Justin's question, I want to revisit and re-release the episodes we did some years ago on the subject of contraception and family planning. Now, if you are a parent and you generally listen to this podcast with younger kids around, I would like to advise you that this might be one of those topics that you want to listen to alone or save for later. It does require some maturity to engage this conversation, and we are going to talk frankly about the human body, about marital sexuality, and about questions surrounding contraception and family planning. And so please be sure that you're listening to this at a time and in a way it'd be appropriate to cover those topics. Now, the voices you're going to hear on this podcast are a much younger version of myself, Dusty White and Chris Hemmelman, along with Mike Kresnick. And then our special guest for this podcast, Jenn Newman. She is a doula, or was serving as a doula at the time, had been a part of the Coram staff and part of the First City Church family, and just really, really wise on these topics. And so we asked her to join the podcast and just had a conversation about all things family planning. And so we've gone back and sort of edited that conversation so that it fits into 2 episodes. And I'm going to give it to you now in part 1, and then part 2 will come next week. Justin, thanks for this very pertinent question. And I hope that this podcast that we recorded some years ago will prove fruitful in answering your question and those of other listeners as well. In this first podcast, I just want to suggest that a biblical worldview shifts the conversation into a different place, because here's the starting point. So let's acknowledge the starting point that we're coming from in our culture. When I say we, I just mean anyone who's sort of grown up in America and comes to Christ, you know. And when I say comes to Christ, I mean you might be a new Christian, or you might have been a Christian most of your life, but you're living and walking in a cultural stream of thinking about sexuality that is post-sexual revolution. Okay, so our culture is very defined by individualism. And if I apply individualism to my sexuality, it means I shouldn't have to have kids if I don't want to, and I should be able to sort of decide what I do with my sexuality, when and how I want to decide that. Now, obviously, as Christians, we would say, okay, well, there's a biblical ethics around sexuality. There's biblical principles that we need to follow in regard to sexuality. And the primary one is sexual expression is reserved for heterosexual marriage. And that's, again, even that is becoming increasingly like under fire in even Christian circles. But that's the clear biblical teaching. But even once we accept that, married couples who are Christians still have a tendency to think about their sexuality primarily as about me and getting my needs met, and not about what does it mean to honor another person and to have a fulfilling and God-honoring sexuality. And those are the questions that bear directly on questions of contraception. So if I'm after having as much sex in whatever ways I want to without the possibility of having kids unless I decide to, then I'm very much in favor of contraception, right, in all its forms. If I question that assumption,
that will change the scorecard by which I evaluate various methods of contraception. And so that's just the starting point, is to acknowledge we live in a culture where the cultural view is any form of contraception is good. Like, you should be fully in charge of your sex life and only have kids if you decide to. That's what explains abortion. That's what explains all forms of contraception. And that's what explains sort of the individualistic approach to sexuality that just says, we shouldn't have to have any connection to children unless we decide, oh gosh, let's have a kid now. Mm-hmm. And I think doing pastoral counseling, this is how most Christian couples approach sexuality. Just like, we want to have lots of sex, and then, if we decide to have kids 5 or 6 years from now, we want to turn that switch on and go, kid time. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of naivety, I think, in that way of thinking, and a lot of implicit cultural assumptions that drive that way of thinking.
Yeah. And Bob, you and I have also, I don't know about the rest of the table, you and I have had to go read some of the Catholic literature on this, because Protestants just haven't done a very great job of tackling this topic. So we've had to learn a lot.
Yeah, this is my frustration, is like, when you start, so a thoughtful Christian who wants to go, how do I honor God in my sexuality? Well, you have to ask the question, okay, what about all these artificial methods of birth control that exist now that didn't exist 100 years ago? What do I do with all this? And so you have to go, well, where do I turn for some biblical wisdom on that? Dusty and I joke that most of the Protestant theologians we've read are so proof texty about this. They're like, well, there's not a verse about condoms in the Bible, so feel free. And like that literally the only reasoning I find from Protestants on this issue is proof texting. It's just, well, is there a verse about this? No. Then it falls within the category of Christian freedom. By contrast, the Catholics lean heavily into natural law on this issue. And if you know thoughtful Catholics, most of them are very opposed to contraception. And the Catholic Church, in its formal teaching, has been very opposed to contraception. And they lean heavily on natural law. And they don't have a lot of Bible verses. They would just say, here's our natural law argument for this. What's interesting about that is, as I read those natural law arguments, I feel like, wow, there's some intelligent thought being put into this question. And so I find myself wondering, like, how come the only thing I can find from Protestants is Bible verses, that basically say, well, the Bible doesn't mention this, so do whatever your conscience says. And then the only thing I can find from Catholics is like these very structured natural law arguments that sometimes go in a real restrictive direction. And there doesn't seem to be anybody sort of making those two talk to each other. The Catholics sort of lament the Protestant point of view. The Protestants are sort of like, hey, we're about Christian freedom. And it just feels like I'm not satisfied really with either one. And so it's an interesting place to be as we try to think about a biblical worldview on this. Here's the thing that challenges me, and that I feel like should challenge all listeners. The universal teaching of every branch of the Christian church until 1930 was that contraception was immoral. The first thing that changed that was the Lambeth Conference in 1930, which was the Anglican Church, moving to say that in certain situations contraception was okay. Okay, so 1930, that's less than 100 years ago. Now, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Protestant theologian anywhere that doesn't say, oh, contraception's fine. So when I step back and go, okay, 1900 years of church history said, nope, this is wrong. Less than 100 years of church history says this is fine, do whatever you want. I want to go, I want to step back and think about that a little bit.
1930 doesn't seem too far away.
Especially when you consider what you just said about maybe the thinness, maybe not necessarily weakness, but thinness of the Protestant argument too. Yeah. That adds to it.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think are some of the unintended consequences of the Protestant world, Protestant theologians, maybe embracing this without a lot of reflection, or even just the thin arguments that have kind of the proof texting? It's because it seems like you said, Bob, the church has, at least the Protestant church, evangelical church, has more or less completely embraced this. How has that affected us as a church? How has it affected our families? I don't even know if we want to step outside the broader culture with this, we can bring that in, but I'm just curious kind of within our own kind of churches, how this has maybe negatively affected us.
Well, positively, it creates a lot of freedom. I mean, a married couple feels like, okay, well, if I have access to multiple kinds of contraception, then great. It sort of creates a deeper freedom in terms of how careful I have to be in my sexual activity if I want to avoid having children at some point in my life. But I think that's the challenge, is we've come to see that as normative. So we've come to see having children as something to be avoided unless and until we decide. And so the seeing children as a blessing, seeing children as something to be welcomed, seeing children as the natural fruit of the sexual act is, I just think that's one of the byproducts, is we think about sex and then having kids almost as different subject or different conversations, you know?
Yeah,
it's like, well, let's talk about sex, but then let's talk about having kids later.
Yeah, that's a whole podcast right there, right? Because that's exactly what we believe. Until I intend to have children, I don't want them.
Right. So our sexuality becomes unhinged from reproduction. And I think there's all kinds of consequences to that. I think it connects to our thinking about marriage and divorce. I think it connects to our thinking about big families versus small families. I think it connects to idolatries of control and independence and autonomy, because the more the more I see my sexuality as something for me to control and for me to be in charge of, it's just reinforcing all those cultural idols that are sort of Western American cultural idols: individualism and autonomy and freedom and personal choice and, whatever I want to do when I want to do it. Mm-hmm. I want to read a little paragraph from an article on the Public Discourse, which is a website journal. This is by Anna Maria Dumitru, who is a MD PhD student at Dartmouth. And here's her reflection. She's a Christian trying to write about contraception. Here's her reflection. Artificial contraceptives are based on the misconception that fertility is bad. The entire marketing scheme, which champions freedom for sexually active men and women, relies on the consumer's belief that their reproductive capacities are unwanted, cumbersome, and potentially dangerous. I think that alone is a question worth stepping back and reflecting on, and just asking the question, as Christians, in our thinking about contraception, are we starting from the assumption that fertility is bad and that freedom is the highest good in our sexuality? Now, I think it's interesting because I think there are certainly couples that we know who struggle with infertility, and they wouldn't say fertility is bad. They say fertility is good, and we feel lament that we're not currently able to experience that. But I think there's a whole set of people in Christian circles who sort of, I think, functionally have this view of like, fertility is bad. It's something to be avoided. I don't want to have kids yet.
Right before we got married, probably a month or two, my wife started taking a pill. It started messing with her body, and so we got off of it for that reason. But we operated right away out of that naive assumption that, like, well, we don't want to have children right away. Obviously, like, it was all intuitive. It was all just subconscious decision. And so by God's grace, we were off of that pretty quickly. But again, we just stumbled into that as naive, youthful Christians. And I think and clearly that was why we were divorcing our sexuality from our fertility and seeing them as two distinct things, when that's just not the case.
Good. And I think that gives us a chance to call time out here and just say, hey, every listener who's a married couple and who's sexually active is practicing some form of contraception, perhaps. And so the goal is not for you to feel guilty about whatever you're doing. The goal is for you to step back and reflect and ask, what are my assumptions? What are our assumptions? What have our assumptions been? And how does the Bible maybe reframe those and challenge those? Because that's my story too, Dusty, right? Like we walked into marriage real naive and just like, well, let's just use this form of birth control because it's easy and
that's
some doctor prescribed it, right? Yeah. And, we trust our doctors a lot. We have a tendency to be like, well, the doctor said this is good, then this must be good. And, we had some sort of moments of having to step back and go, yeah, this isn't good. Mm-hmm. And we haven't thought deeply enough about this.
All under the banner that it's safe and non-invasive.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a good place to step into this part of the conversation. And this is where we'll get in some trouble. Because I want to avoid being prescriptive. I want to avoid saying, here's what you should do. But I do think there are moral questions here and ethical questions here. And so ethical questions always involve shoulds, right? So having this as my own story, I feel comfortable saying, hey, this was my story. We started out our marriage using a pill form of birth control. Same story, Dusty, that started to mess with my wife's cycle in ways that we just didn't appreciate. It felt like it was creating other, problems. Additionally, as we started researching chemical birth control, almost every form of chemical birth control is abortive in nature, meaning the way that it works is it does not prevent a sperm from fertilizing an egg. What it does is it prevents a fertilized egg from implanting in the womb. You might say it this way. It makes the womb an unwelcoming place for a fertilized egg. As Christians, we believe that life begins at conception. And that means what every form of chemical birth control is doing is terminating life. And once you come to that conclusion, I believe you cannot, in good conscience as a Christian, use that form of birth control. Now, again, that's coming from someone who used that form of birth control and then came to that conviction and had to go, gosh, this is not good. So I want to say that with some grace and gentleness, but the medical community, by and large, is dead set on not drawing these connections for you. So you have to find a thoughtful Christian doctor, and they are out there, who will help you understand this. But if you talk to, there are studies that you can find, medical journals, that describe the processes by which every birth control pill works. They're all sort of different in their technology, but they all functionally work that same way. And you need to do the research in order to understand how they work so that you can step back and start to ask the ethical questions about them. So I think that's the first starting point for any conversation about contraception is if you're currently using a chemical form of birth control as a married couple, you need to step back and start wrestling with the ethics of that as a starting point. I was just talking with a female doctor friend of mine this past weekend, and she pointed out that, some doctors prescribe birth control to girls at age 13 because it helps with acne, right? And so you have girls who have never actually experienced a period because the chemical function of those pills, some of them, just shuts down the cycle. It doesn't. They have a period once a year or something like that. So they will get married 22, 23, 25, 27, 35, whatever, and have never actually experienced like a normal reproductive cycle in their lifetime. And so this doctor friend of mine said, you can't imagine how a decade of that kind of use of the body or that kind of understanding of the body changes the body's own capacities for things. And so that is another piece of this that we have to acknowledge, is to say, God made our bodies and designed them to function in certain ways. And as Christians, we need to receive our bodies as gifts from God and learn how to work with them rather than seeking to work against them. And that philosophical consideration alone has some implications then for how we start to think about various forms of contraception as well. So yeah, this is the danger of talking about ethical questions, is we need to embrace right and wrong, good and evil, ethics. And we also need to avoid shame and guilt and self-loathing that can come to us as we recognize our failures in these areas. And so we just want to reiterate, the goal of this podcast is to start an ethical conversation and even make some ethical statements in ways that hopefully help listeners step back and wrestle with questions in their own lives. And so please hear us as loving the people of our church and wanting to spur thoughtful conversation about these things rather than as being overly prescriptive or as piling on to people who feel any sort of guilt or shame and who haven't been reflective on these issues, perhaps even till right now. I'm going to read from an email from a friend of mine who is a doctor. She is a woman. She is deeply knowledgeable on these things, and she wanted us to be as precise as possible in how we describe them. So here you go. Hormonal or chemical contraceptives try to prevent ovulation and decrease sperm mobility to try to prevent fertilization of an egg. But the final mechanism of action that makes the pill so close to 100% effective as a contraceptive agent is that it makes the uterus as hostile an environment as possible and thus prevents implantation of a fertilized egg, as anyone who has conceived or had an ectopic pregnancy while taking the pill can testify. So the problem with that is if you were taking the pill, you never know, is pregnancy being prevented because it's keeping sperm from fertilizing the egg, or because an egg was fertilized but not implanted. And it's that lack of knowledge that creates ethical problems. She goes on to mention this as far as IUDs, quote, copper IUDs work by thinning the uterine wall lining to prevent implantation of a fertilized egg. There are also hormonal IUDs that work by combining the thinning of the uterine lining to prevent implantation of a fertilized egg with the release of hormones to try to prevent ovulation and slow sperm movement to try to prevent it from reaching the egg. So both types of IUDs also use various methods of thinning the uterine wall lining. One is the primary method, and one of them, hormonal IUDs, use that as a secondary method, but both of them do that. And so what that means is that both these forms of contraception, for Christians who believe that life begins at conception, these become then morally problematic. And so, guys, I realize for some listeners, this is the first time they've ever heard this or thought about this, because, these aren't the kinds of things that all doctors talk about. Chris, you mentioned you have a brother-in-law, right, who's a Christian doctor. And so Christian doctors often do describe these things, but many doctors are just saying, oh, you need birth control, here you go. And they're not going to tell you the mechanisms by which it works. And so unless you're really into reading the fine print, listeners may not even know that this is how these forms of birth control function. So having given those clarifiers so that you understand the full mechanism of action for both chemical, hormonal birth control, and various forms of IUDs, today on the podcast, we have a special guest, Jenn Newman.
Dun, dun, dun,
Hey, Jenn.
dun.
Hey,
Jenn
guys.
Newman is on the podcast.
Is this your first time on the podcast?
It's my first time on the podcast.
Welcome to the Wednesday Conversation. Wait, Mike, would you tell her that?
Jenn, welcome to the Wednesday
There you go.
conversation.
Thanks, Mike.
So Jenn Newman, plays so many vital roles. Here's the background on Jenn. She is my executive assistant, works on staff at Coram Deo, former member of Coram Deo, helped to plant First City Church. Most importantly to this conversation, she's a doula, works with Omaha Birth Connection. Can you tell, by the way, cool little business started by someone in our church. What does Omaha Birth Connection do, Jenn?
Yeah, Omaha Birth Connection wants to provide any services necessary to women who are pregnant or who have already given birth. So we want to connect women to postpartum doulas, to labor doulas, and provide any other services that could help them through labor, delivery.
Basically, if you're a mama and you're going to give birth to a baby, these folks want to come around you and make that as rich and as meaningful an experience as possible, and
Yes.
help to support that, right?
Yes.
Childbirth and child rearing.
Yep.
So really cool. And Jenn is with child right now.
Yes. So there actually are 6 people here
There are
for the Wednesday
There
conversation.
are actually 6 of us here today. And so we're going to, a lot of the response we got was, hey, I'd love to hear a woman talk about contraception, just because obviously this is a much more of a personal topic for women because it's affecting their body week to week, month to month. And so that's also true for husbands, of course, but in a different way. And so because of how embodied this is for women. And so, Jenn, we wanted to talk, because we work alongside Jenn and because we have a pretty open office and we talk about all kinds of stuff related to life and theology. I happen to know that Jenn and her husband, Ryan, have practiced a fertility awareness method of birth control and contraception, which not a whole lot of folks know about. I mean, it's getting more and more popular, but there's a lot of people probably listening to this podcast who have misconceptions about how this works. And I want to sort of raise awareness, especially as we talk about contraception, that there are very natural and normal methods of contraception that work with the body instead of against it. And so we brought Jenn on because, Jenn, I was hoping you could talk from your firsthand experience about why you and Ryan chose to use this method, what you enjoy about it. And you've obviously used it in 2 ways. You've used it to prevent conception and to allow conception. And so for that reason, I think you can talk from both sides of that, because a lot of the questions we're getting, especially from young couples, are like, hey, how do I think through this, and how do I make a wise decision here? And isn't it true that this method doesn't actually work, and like, it can't actually function as a way of preventing conception? So, Jen, the floor is yours. Talk to us about fertility awareness methods, or FAM.
Or FAM. Yeah. So when my husband and I got engaged and started thinking about family planning and what that would look like for us for the first couple of years, or as we started to try for children, I started to do a lot of research on different forms of birth control, whether it were hormonal or different barrier methods, or what I came to hear about, the fertility awareness method. And I knew like the hormonal stuff, putting chemicals into my body, just didn't sit well with me. And I wasn't even thinking about the abortive nature of different hormonal birth control pills. But I just knew that I didn't want to put something foreign in my body at all. So we moved from there as, okay, what are my options then? There are different barrier methods that would be an option. So that would be like a condom or a female condom. And there are a wide range of things that people can use. And then I had a friend say, well, you should read this book called Taking Charge of Your Fertility. And
excellent book.
Yes, excellent book. People call it the Bible for the fertility awareness method. So I started to read it and was amazed at how much I didn't know just about my body, period. Like, not even trying to have kids, not even trying to prevent, how much I did not know about my body as a woman hormonally. And so what I started to learn is that from the time a young girl gets her period, her body every 28 days or so goes through a natural flow of hormones. So she has her period, she has a surge of estrogen, she releases an egg, and then she has a surge of progesterone, and then that egg is probably not fertilized, and so she sheds her uterine lining, and that's her period, and it starts over. And that's what goes through every single cycle. And so started to learn that, gosh, there are these other things that I've noticed about my body that it's just always been doing this. And so I became really intrigued with the fertility awareness method because it seemed like the best way Ryan and I could work with my body and what it was doing, what it's meant to do and what it's always done, rather than against it, trying to change or alter that. So, so fertility awareness method, people call it the symptothermo method as well. So we observe my fertility signs throughout the month. That means I'm observing my cervical fluid. And so that is telling me when my cervical fluid changes throughout the month, as far as what would be a happy environment for sperm to live in and to fertilize an egg. And then I'm also taking my temperature. So before I ovulate, my waking temperature at about the same, I wake up about the same time every morning, take my temperature, is going to be lower. And then as I ovulate, it will rise and be high for the rest of my cycle, confirming that I've ovulated.
You want to talk about that really cool thermometer? You did like a Kickstarter campaign for this high-level thermometer. That's
yes, there's a free app to track your cycles called Kindara. Kindara made a thermometer that is called the Wink, and it is so smart. It syncs with your phone. You take your temperature and it sends it.
This is not like low tech. This is super high tech.
Super high tech.
Fertility awareness.
Super
right here.
smart. Whoa. So a lot of the like the pushback you get for the fertility awareness method is like, well, gosh, isn't it guesswork? You don't really know. But when practiced correctly, it can be just as effective as birth control pill, condoms, whatever.
Yeah, in fact, I'm looking at a medical study on my computer right now that says when used correctly, it's 90% effective. So that's as effective or more effective than most barrier methods, and as effective as the pill when practiced correctly. And that's probably the catch.
We have some good friends that have used this method, and they have 4 kids now, and she's such a guru at it. She has perfectly timed their kids 2 years apart. Their kids' birthdays all are like within a week of each other. So she's kind of a guru in this. So
this works when you do it right.
Yeah.
So you get to know your body, which I really appreciated being able to do that even before we were married, so I started talking about it then to single women, like, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we getting to know our bodies before we are married, even if we never get married? Because if I have a short luteal phase at the end, which is after you've ovulated to when your period comes, I might be low in progesterone, or I could actually have cycle after cycle where I'm not confirming ovulation. And so it can actually help determine like whole health as well, which I was really encouraged by. So it's not just for married people or people who are trying to conceive or even not. So that's something I've really enjoyed about it. And like just for our family as well, I mean, it just becomes like normal conversation. So we're just like,
how's your cervical fluid
we're just
today?
like going to bed, and Ryan's like, so condom or no condom tonight? And he knows like, are you fertile or are you not fertile? And so like, it's a conversation that is happening between both of us, which I think is important, because the pill or other types of barrier methods, it can largely fall on just being the woman's responsibility. And so I think it's been really special for us to share that and for him to understand where my body is throughout the month and work with that with me.
For people who are skeptical, Jen, even after they listen to you talk and say, you know, well, the advantage of something like the pill is you don't have to think about it other than just taking it, and it doesn't affect spontaneity, and you can have sex whenever you want. So for people who sort of are coming from that point of view, what would you try to persuade them of, like, hey, actually this method is better?
Yeah, Mike and I were talking about this earlier, and I said I wanted to be unapologetic about saying that I think this is the best option for women, for their health and for honoring their bodies and for honoring God and honoring their husbands and wives doing this together. So for ease or spontaneity or what it might affect that, like as you grow comfortable with it, there's a wide part of your cycle that you can be spontaneous in.
Good, yeah.
And also, I would say, like, you have like your beginning of your cycle where you know you're not going to be fertile. You have your middle cycle where your signs are lining up and saying conception could be a possibility. And then afterwards, the two windows where you know conception is not possible, I think tend to be more full of freedom and more excitement because you're not worried about what could happen in the middle if you're trying to avoid pregnancy. And so I think for us, it's definitely changed those two sides of the cycle of like, this is like really fun because we know exactly where we're at and we're able to even almost like play more.
Friends, we're going to break there for part 1. We'll come back next week and continue. The goal of this podcast is to equip our own church for discipleship and mission. So if you're a Christian or church leader in another context, thank you for listening in. We pray that this conversation might be helpful to you as you minister in your context. And as you can tell from this episode, we always love to hear from listeners, and we take their input seriously as we think about topics. So if you have thoughts, questions, or topics you'd like us to consider, send an email to podcast@cdomaha.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for another episode of The Wednesday Conversation.